This is Kim Meyer, host of Choose to Rise. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Strike three, you're out.
Welcome to Caught Listening, a brand new episode of Caught Listening, the baseball show that goes beyond the white lines. Christian Heimel here with you, as we do every single week, part of the Public House Media Network. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, review, share us with your friends and family this holiday season. You can find us on every platform pretty much. Amazon Podcast, Google and Apple Play, of course, Spreaker.com, Stitcher.com, Spotify, and publichousemedia.org. This will be the final show of the 2020 calendar year, a year that I'm sure many of us are excited to say farewell to. And we will continue on and end the year with our In Memoriam series here, focusing on a gentleman, again, a lot of legends of the game lost in 2020, but one for really kind of epitomized a franchise more than maybe almost anybody else who has passed this year. Obviously, you do have some incredible folks such as Lou Brock, Joe Morgan, Whitey Ford, but I'm not sure how many people epitomized a franchise and are still revered by not only the fans of the team, but the franchise itself, as Tom Seaver, the great New York Met pitcher. And to help us talk about Tom, his life, his legacy, is the best sports columnist for Newsday. Neil, we appreciate the time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. In fact, I did an essay last week just about all the prominent sports deaths in 2020, and I really tried to come up with the ideal lineup of baseball players who died. And it would certainly be a World Series favorite going into a season with that. I mean, obviously the pitching rotation with Seaver, Gibson, and Whitey Ford is a pretty good start. But I mean, it's an amazing roster. It's crazy.
It's if you had to take a pitching rotation of all timers, you'd be hard pressed to find people who didn't include at least two of those three: Gibson, Seaver, Ford, somebody in there. With how,
and then I mentioned. Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, but just how dominant they were and how impactful they still are within the history of the game.
I know, and then I was like, well, then Don Larson would be good for a spot start in a World Series game, of course. So it was like, it's crazy. I mean, I'm obviously I don't want to laugh at these guys passing away. It's really a tribute to just how many great players we lost this year, and especially, I mean, I'm 60, so I didn't see Whitey Ford play, but I saw most of these guys play. Even a guy like Al Kaline late in his career, Lou Brock late in his career. So I saw pretty much all of them, not Larson and Ford, but most of them.
And it again, just a year where so many were lost, and it was, one of the things that was more so impactful. One of the things that, and I said this last week when we talked about Whitey Ford's passing on the show, it's one of those things that you almost forget what they meant off the field or some of those other accolades and the type of people they were until they pass. And it's one of those things that, with Tom Seaver is one of those guys, I can remember going, it's still probably going to any Mets game, whether it's home or road, invariably you're going to see at least one 41 jersey in blue and orange pinstripes. I mean, there's a reason he's nicknamed the franchise.
Yeah, and it's, and I'm the perfect age for it. I mean, I feel weird being old enough now so that I have to sort of provide, testimony to people too young to remember these players, but, it is what it is. And the fact of the matter is that, when I was a kid, the people a little bit older than me were all the Mickey Mantle fans, and of course, I didn't really see Mickey Mantle play, but for my generation, I was at the sweet spot for Seaver, and even Steve Cohen, who's 4 years older than me, that was basically he was the favorite player of every person that age who was not a Yankees fan. And he did mean everything for that franchise. He was just this sort of clean-cut, guy, and with the attractive wife and the house in the suburbs, and then he comes to this team that was awful, and then he was immediately great. In 67 as a rookie, he was already, people could see he was a major star. And, he was the symbol of that franchise, and as you said, he still is, because the 86 Mets had a lot of memorable characters, obviously, and players revered from it, like, Keith Hernandez and Gooden and Strawberry and Gary Carter, but there wasn't that one player who stood above the rest. And the 69 Mets, really did not have a lot of superstars. When you look at they had a lot of very good players and good young pitching, obviously, but they didn't have major national type stars on that team, really. Even today, when you look back at the roster, Nolan Ryan was there, but he was a kid, and Seaver was the guy. Period. And like you said, he still is 51 years later.
It's incredible to watch, and the comparison between the 69, the Miracle Mets, and the 86 Mets. Again, you just rattled off multiple names from the 86 team, and maybe this is somewhat recency bias, and there might be more people still around who remember the 86 Mets and remember all of those names. Of course, the way it ended, it probably has a reason to do with that in terms of memorability. But the 69 team, and to go from an expansion franchise to a World Series team within 3 years is pretty much unheard of in any sport. And 3 years of a rebuilding process is almost unheard of in any sport, even in today's age. But that 69 squad, and as you said, Tom was kind of the one that stood above the rest. But what he meant to that team and how his legacy and his legend status kind of grew from that year.
Yeah, it's a similar dynamic, obviously, in New York to Joe Namath, because same thing, where he was kind of this guy who just, came like it was a tornado of publicity and stuff, and also 50 years later, the Jets haven't even been to a Super Bowl. At least the Mets won another World Series. But it was a similar kind of dynamic where, he just captured the attention of I think another important thing is he was the kind of guy who was revered by by kids like me, but also that the middle-aged people could kind of get behind and like and respect, whereas Joe Namath maybe turned off some of that era's 60-year-olds. It was the kids who liked Joe Namath. But Tom Seaver appealed to everybody. As a personality, which after I got to actually know him a little bit in later years, he was definitely prickly and did not suffer fools gladly. I mean, he was not an easy guy to get along with for people he worked with. I'm not saying he was a bad guy. He was just a very opinionated guy, and again, he didn't like people who weren't, hardworking, weren't smart, weren't, he didn't take a lot. He just didn't let things slide. He was a very demanding guy, and obviously that's part of what made him such a great pitcher, because he was stubborn and competitive and all those things you have to be. He was the perfect guy to come along, and with that team, my first year paying attention to them was 69, so I didn't even remember them being terrible. But when you see how that roster was built, even though their records were still bad all through the mid to late 60s, it was coming. It was this, every year they'd add another piece, and Seaver was the biggest one, but there were a lot of others, and then it all just kind of happened all at once. And that has happened other times in baseball history, obviously, where a team, just kind of arrives. But in that era, it was less common just because obviously there was no free agency, and, it just took more time usually for things to happen. So I know that in that people were just kind of blown away by how quickly the Mets just were, suddenly a 100-win team. And then even after winning 100 wins, they were a huge underdog to the Orioles in the World Series, and I thought all was lost after Buford led off Game 1 with a home run, and Seaver lost Game 1. But, of course, the Mets won the next 4, and that was it.
It's interesting, and we're talking with Neil Best, sports columnist for Newsday, on the life and legacy of New York Mets pitcher Tom Seaver. It was interesting reading back about him and his career, and this is what's amazing for Mets fans. And I grew up, my father is still to this day a diehard Mets fan, so I kind of live the heartbreak through him sometimes. This tremendously talented pitcher very easily could have ended up with the Atlanta Braves at the start of his career. Yeah. And really it's just another one of those things that you look at, and it's one of those near misses in terms of for the Mets that they were on the right side of that time.
Yeah, I think about weird things. I mean, I was thinking about that kind of thing this week when the Jets seem to have lost Trevor Lawrence because of some random game, the meaningless game. And, how these types of things can change the course of sports history. And, that Seaver could very easily have been with the Braves. And it was great for New York sports fans, obviously, but also probably for baseball in general, because obviously in that era, the Yankees were kind of carrying the New York market, but to have a National League team here after 4 years where all those National League fans who were used to hating the Yankees had nowhere to go, and then, it took another 7 years for them to be good. The ramifications of that were just huge, just for MLB in general, to have a team like a franchise be successful in New York. And obviously they didn't win another World Series with him, but they were good for, another several years. Obviously they were in the World Series in '73, and he was good. He kept being good. He wasn't like a flash in the pan, obviously. And then, and even in his later years, I was at Yankee Stadium in 1985 when he won his 300th game for the White Sox, and all the Mets fans went to the game to root against the Yankees because they wanted to see Seaver win his 300th game. So, he was around a really long time. Mm-hmm. It's just he's so associated with that one team that sometimes you forget how long and successful a career he had. Which again is a contrast to a guy like Joe Namath who flamed out very quickly, mostly because of injuries. But Seaver was he was really good for 20 years.
That's the impressive part. 20 years, and that I think not so much impressive in terms of his longevity, but impressive in terms of his impact with the New York Mets, because 20 seasons in Major League Baseball, as you said, his 300th win came with the Chicago White Sox at Yankee Stadium, but 11 of those 20 years spent with the New York Mets, his first 10 with New York. He won all 3 Cy Youngs there, obviously the World Series, but the Midnight Massacre, as it was known, the trade that sent him to Cincinnati in '77, and then to come back to the Mets for one more year, but after his playing career to get back involved with the Mets in some way, shape, or form. How much did the post-trade Tom Seaver, or how much did the things that went on after that trade in '77 really help solidify and help maybe bring back and ensure that his legacy remains with the New York Mets?
Yeah, I mean, his later years as a player, obviously, it was hard. He was kind of, when he's not playing in New York, he's a little bit out of sight, out of mind, even though that trade, the bitterness from that trade certainly didn't go away. But then after his playing days, he did Mets and Yankees games as an announcer, and he was around and, involved with, whatever, reunions and things like that. So he was there for the last game at Shea, the first game at Citi Field. So the franchise certainly kept him involved. I mean, obviously somewhat selfishly, because they need, obviously it benefited them to keep him around just because the fans loved seeing him. But I think he enjoyed it. He threw out the first pitch at the 2013 All-Star game. So until his health started deteriorating, he definitely remained heavily involved. The only downside to that, of course, is that when that happens, and again, I'll use Namath as another example, it sort of indicates that you haven't had any recent successes. So it's great having an iconic figure still be involved with the franchise, but sometimes you'd like to have fans under 40, have someone they can relate to. So that's sometimes that's one of the things about '69 that I think about how old. When they had their 50th anniversary stuff last year, and of course Seaver wasn't able to participate, it's like it really, to me, like 25th reunions are kind of nostalgia. 75th reunions are just history. 50th reunions are like a gray area where, you kind of really see how old these guys are and how old you are if you remember the team. And, the '69 Mets have really had not great luck with health, generally speaking. But even the ones who are healthy are, whatever, they're in their mid-70s now. And it's just kind of a reality check of how long ago that was. And I see it now with, I've noticed, when the Yankees do an old-timers game,
right,
and the guys from the 90s get these great ovations, and the guys from the 70s championship teams that I grew up with are like, oh, yeah, who's that old guy? Oh, Reggie Jackson. Oh, yeah, I've heard that name. Yeah, and then you get, plaid applause, like it used to be for DiMaggio or whatever. Now it's like they like seeing Paul O'Neill, and they like seeing Derek Jeter, obviously. But, yeah, so the '69 Mets are really old. Just like me.
But again, just tremendous legendary status, and again, a lot of that because of what he did on the field. how he stayed involved off the field, obviously, until his health, as you mentioned, deteriorating. Tom passing away earlier this year, combination of not only COVID-19, but, of course, dementia, which he had been suffering for a while. That moment that the 2013 All-Star game, I was fortunate enough to be there, and not as a Mets fan, but to be able to see David Wright with Tom Seaver and all of these things, and that stadium giving him that kind of ovation, that kind of love, you could tell that it was he loves that organization just as much as that organization loved him.
Yeah, and I actually saw, speaking of David Wright, I think it was 2012, so the year before the All-Star game, there was an event at the 92nd Street Y where they had it was like the best player at each position or something like that all time, and Seaver and Wright were both there, and I remember being on the stage afterwards waiting to talk to Seaver, and he was just having, he was having this heart-to-heart with David Wright and sharing, just sort of advice and just general sort of bonding. Which was kind of cool. I mean, obviously David Wright was kind of the guy at that point, and to see that generational passing of the torch was, and I'm sure David Wright's the kind of guy who I'm sure did appreciate that.
His health, as you mentioned, deteriorating. Tom passing away earlier this year, combination of not only COVID-19, but of course dementia, which he had been suffering for a while. That moment. That the 2013 All-Star game, I was fortunate enough to be there, and not as a Mets fan, but to be able to see David Wright with Tom Seaver and all of these things, and that stadium giving him that kind of ovation, that kind of love, you could tell that it was he loves that organization just as much as that organization loved him.
Yeah, and I actually saw, speaking of David Wright, I think it was 2012, so the year before the All-Star game, there was an event at the 92nd Street Y where they had it was like the best player at each position or something like that all time, and Seaver and Wright were both there, and I remember being on the stage afterwards waiting to talk to Seaver, and he was just having, he was having this heart-to-heart with David Wright and sharing, just sort of advice and just general sort of bonding. Which was kind of cool. I mean, obviously David Wright was kind of the guy at that point, and to see that generational passing of the torch was, and I'm sure David Wright's the kind of guy who I'm sure did appreciate that. He definitely he cared, and he wanted the Mets to be good, and even if they usually weren't, he was rooting for them. There's no question about that. Well, him as a player that I think is also interesting to me is that these days, obviously, we're used to the fact that, there's 18 strikeouts a game or whatever. Right. But the strikeout totals given his era, the fact that he struck out 10 guys in a row in this era doesn't seem that crazy. But back then, there were some strikeout pitchers, obviously, but it just wasn't as common to just have huge strikeout totals, and some of his numbers are just crazy. So, like I said, just even more so given the era it was, when batters actually didn't like to strike out. So it's it's different now, obviously.
Crazy how times have changed. He's sixth all-time in strikeouts, 3,640, and just one of only two pitchers with 300 wins, 3,000 strikeouts, and a career ERA under 3. The only other one being Walter Johnson. So, again, just incredibly talented, incredibly dominant for him. One of the things that I always find interesting about players in general is what they do post-playing career. We talked about Tom and his broadcasting. Some players go broadcasting, some players go coaching, some players just kind of go away. But Tom really had an affinity for wine and getting involved in that and had his own vineyard. I mean, and maybe it's from growing up in California, but his post-playing career and that side of things, spending time obviously with his wife Nancy and whatnot, but as he got into that older age and as he kind of went away from being everyday baseball related, what kind of things and how much, I guess fun was Tom having in those other avenues?
Well, yeah, I mean, I always got the sense that the broadcasting was something he just kind of dabbled in. I mean, you're right, the wine thing was by far and away his number one passion post-playing, and I guess it started when he was still playing. But, he took it very seriously because he didn't want it to be just, he didn't want it to be some, like, hobby. He wanted it to be serious. which it was. And I'm no wine expert, but I gather his wine is respected, and he wasn't just, I'm going to slap my name on a label and be done with it. He took it seriously, and I also think in terms of his involvement with stuff like broadcasting or just going to Mets reunions or whatever, I think he loved his California home so much that just geographically he got to be isolated and do his thing out there instead of being living in suburban New York or something and being expected to show up for things all the time. So I do think his little isolated world out there in his vineyard was also something he liked about the wine business, was just the atmosphere of it. And being away from New York, where people, I'm sure people in Northern California know who Tom Seaver is, but it's not the same as being in New York and constantly being Tom Seaver,
Yeah, 100%. One of the things, last thing before I let you know, we're talking with Neil Best, sports columnist for Newsday here. This was a year, and I always think about this when a, athlete, celebrity in some way, shape, or form, someone of that stature passes away, and it's not just it's interesting. It's not just the family that grieves. It's an entire fan base that grieves for someone. And I remember specifically, the one that maybe hit me the most, which was surprising because I'm not a Lakers fan, was Kobe Bryant, and a lot of that being his age, having something to do with it. But to have those mass gatherings, those memorials that the fans can attend, that they can have that kind of grieving process, whatever it is, didn't get to happen this year. Obviously, fans not allowed in ballparks, but hopefully 2021 allows an opportunity for that to happen at Citi Field in Queens with that number 41. What do you expect, or what would you think the scene would be like when the Mets can have their Tom Seaver Day with their fans and allow those people to all gather together and remember and memorialize Tom Terrific?
Well, first of all, obviously it'll be a special event and people will appreciate it, and it should happen. Like you said, people didn't get those opportunities this year. The only thing that I would say, like I was kind of alluded to earlier, it's a different feel when a guy of that, not that he was 90 years old, but I think it'll be more of an appreciation instead of like an emotional outpouring. Like, when a guy like, when Thurman Munson died, or Kobe, like you mentioned, these shocking, sudden deaths of young players is a different feel. It's more, it's more just shock and emotion. I think with a guy like Seaver, it's going to be more appreciation. And obviously, if you're a younger Mets fan, one would hope that you realize what he meant and kind of give him that appreciation. It's just a less, it's a less emotional thing because of just the generational part. But even 25-year-old Mets fans obviously understand what this guy meant even today. And I know they appreciate him.
He's Neil Best, sports columnist for Newsday. Neil, we appreciate the time. Thank you so much. Happy holidays, and hopefully we get back into a baseball stadium with full crowds in 2021.
Yes, that would be good. All right, thanks for having me.
That's Neil Best, sports columnist for Newsday. You can follow him on Twitter at SportsWatch. And if you ever wondered how much a legacy, a guy who, for you younger listeners that maybe didn't realize or don't know what Tom Seaver meant, think about this. Tom Brady tried to trademark Tom Terrific in 2019, and the U.S. Trademark and Patent Office said no because it could imply a relationship with Tom Seaver. That's how impactful that man was, not just for the New York Mets, but for baseball and for sports as a whole. We appreciate Neil's time. We appreciate your guys' time in listening. Our final show of 2020, we will be back better than ever on January 7th. With brand new shows as we head into a brand new calendar year. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, review, share us with your friends and family wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us on social media. Just search Caught Listening by Public House Media on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Let us know what you want us to talk about on the show. And until next year, I'm Christian Heimel. You have been Caught Listening.